Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Talent Finders would like to welcome attorney and partner at McLaughlin and Stone, Stephen Newburgh, out of New York and Miami. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Karen, for having me on your show.
So Stephen, firstly, I'd like to congratulate you on all your achievements. Can you please share with us how your career started and what led you to specialize in such a niche area of law? Can you please tell us more about this?
Of course, and I think it's probably a common story for many bankruptcy litigation specialists and bankruptcy practitioners where my career started out in 1982 clerking for Judge Raymond Ray, actually before he became a United States bankruptcy judge. And that gave me a flavor, really, of what bankruptcy was all about. But as things are very common with lawyers coming out of law school, we try to search for the best position initially.
Yes.
And the next position from Judge Ray was with a firm doing commercial, very complex commercial litigation.
Yes.
So naturally, I became a commercial litigator for about 20 years.
Oh, wow.
That was, of course, trying very complex and large cases, mostly having to do with Article 9 of the UCC, which concerns security interests and foreclosure of those security interests. That background naturally led me into bankruptcy practice because the realization that the UCC and secured transactions need to be treated a special way once a bankruptcy is filed fascinated me. I started reading about not just the code, the bankruptcy code, Title 11, but the historical basis for the formation of the code, which just fascinated me, how we really went from biblical provisions in Leviticus about forgiveness of debt, things like that, into the pre-code era where we had the Act, and the Bankruptcy Act naturally went into a much more structured way or manner when the bankruptcy code was implemented. When that happened, all of my experience as a commercial litigator, trying cases before non-juries and juries and being very comfortable in the courtroom, I actually love it.
Yeah.
That led me to become not just a bankruptcy lawyer, but to really want to get into the most interesting area, which is Chapter 11. Both for creditors and debtors. However, now, as you probably know, I have a very, very interesting specialty of wholesale and retail energy supply.
Yes.
And those things are called ESCOs, by the way. So if we have a conversation that gravitates into this other area where you're hearing a lot of abbreviated terms, it's because that's the trade that now has been imprinted in my brain. We talk about ISOs, we talk about ESCOs, we talk about retail and wholesale energy supply, we talk about flow.
Yes.
We understand how meters are read by a utility because we're supplying a utility within an ISO, and all of that is regulated by each state in addition to the ISO itself, which is sort of like a political division of various states. And it's an association every energy supplier must be a part of or admitted to in order to give a flow to that state. When I say flow, it could be natural gas or it could be electricity.
Yes.
So I think the gravitation is a great question for me because it helps others to know how to get where I am.
Yes.
And that's important too. There are very few lawyers in this country that can do what I do, which is the wind down, for example, of an energy supply company. You
Yes.
have hundreds of thousands of customers at stake. And the goal is to make sure that those customers are not what we call hard dropped. And when they are hard dropped, it means the utility rate is they default to a utility rate at the utility level, like Con Ed, and all of a sudden their bills are triple because they're going from a fixed rate for their energy, whether it be natural gas or electricity, to a variable rate. And that is so critical and so important in making sure in Chapter 11 that customers are not prejudiced, even though they are far, far away from us in the hierarchy of how things work. What do? We have to politically make deals with every single party involved in that chain of supply and in the regulatory aspects as well. We have to be friends with the Department of Revenue of every state. We have to know people within the ISO that governs those states. And we have to know the people in the utilities because deals have to be made to return collateral. We call it collateral. And millions of dollars for each energy supplier are posted with every utility that they're flowing through. There are millions of dollars posted in letters of credit to back up the use, for example, of their lines. And so millions of dollars are pledged by a company. They need to be brought back into the bankruptcy estate, for goodness sakes. $200 or $300 million or $30 million, depending upon how large that ESCO might be, that energy supplier. So a bit of a long-winded response, but I just want to give everyone a preview of what I'm really doing. The other thing right now that I gravitated in from commercial litigation is I represent several very, very large class actions in the United States. And right now I have 5 class actions that I'm representing. As bankruptcies are filed, Chapter 11s, these class actions are pending in a U.S. district court somewhere or in a state court. And you have to bring a proper type of claim for a class action in Chapter 11, or you're not going to get anything. So I'm protecting right now probably approximately 350,000 members of various classes in the bankruptcy courts, mostly in Delaware and New York, because most of our cases are filed there.
So that leads me on to, this is obviously a follow-on to what you're talking about. So you've obviously been involved in some very big bankruptcy cases and saved a hotel as just one example of many. So can you share with our audience and give us some insight into how you managed to achieve this?
Part of Chapter 11, hard to really explain, but part of Chapter 11 is to be able to respond to things on a day-to-day basis in real time. Not like regular commercial litigation where you have a pleading to answer and you have 30 days to answer and you can relax in between. There is no relaxation here. It's a 24/7 job, no joke. 15-hour days are very common with me. I actually enjoy it. But that hotel is a great example of luck, because had it not been for my ability to find an investor at the 11th hour, the case would have gone to Chapter 7 and it would have been lost. What happened there, fascinating. And it's probably best I not use the case names and whatnot, because certain rights are still out there. I'm not really allowed to comment on them, but I can give you a close approximation of what happened. That case was a nightmare. Why? Well, a hotel doesn't own the land it's on. It's leasing it. So when we talk about the bankruptcy of a hotel in this situation, where they're not owning the land, they're leasing it, that's all personal property as opposed to real property. So we talk about these in rem remedies with regard to bankruptcy cases where there's property involved, but it's not real property, it's personal property. That could be rights to a forward contract, as we call it in bankruptcy court, where there might not be stay applicable. It could be contracts with the government, just like the case we're going to talk about in a second. And it could be fixtures that are in that hotel that belong to the hotel. It's the trade name of the hotel. So even though you have a hotel that is leasing the property, the values are tremendous. So you never lose it. And what happened in that case was a miracle. we really had several different investors to come in to rescue this hotel. And I needed to bring in several $1,000,000 just to cover enough to get through the Chapter 11 through what we call a structured dismissal, which if any of your listeners know about the Jevick case in Delaware, your hair will stand up because you're not really allowed to have a structured dismissal. So what I did was I designed a hybrid of a structured dismissal so I wouldn't get an objection from the U.S. Trustee's office.
Yeah.
And I by the U.S. trustee before I even file it, which I always do, and is required to do in some states and some jurisdictions. But for me, everything's politics and how you do it, and
yes,
giving
and attention to detail.
Well, that's a foregone conclusion. If you're not paying attention to detail, you would never be in a position to negotiate with anybody or to even be in Chapter 11. So we take perfection for granted. It's all perfect when it's filed, and the concepts have been fully researched. And so that if the trustee asks me a question or the other opposing parties, the creditors ask me a question, I can answer it and give them an answer that gives them some comfort, assurance. Because if you start fighting in Chapter 11, what you're doing is you are wasting administrative expenses. Those come out of somewhere, and whoever has to pay for those administrative expenses, it's a big hit. And those administrative expenses, just a little brief primer, after a Chapter 11 is filed, every obligation that you incur that's a new obligation after the date you file, it becomes an administrative expense of the estate. It's got to get paid. If you don't pay them all and you don't have enough money to pay them all, you become, as a matter of law, subject to Chapter 7 conversion, where you lose everything. A trustee takes over, the lawyers are all sent their separate ways. We're oftentimes subject to a deposition, for God's sakes. I have to hand over all my notes, my pleadings, and this Chapter 7 is for no other purpose than to auction off whatever is there, whatever's left.
Yeah, to make the money back.
And to also file what we call, in the colloquial sense, Chapter 5 proceedings. And that's, we're talking about 11 U.S.C. Section 500 et sequitur, which provides for all of these rights and remedies of a trustee, which a debtor in possession is, in terms of clawing back money. For example, money is paid 90 days prior to the filing. Money is paid a year prior to the filing under certain circumstances. Money is paid or exchanged perhaps in an improper way under 11 U.S.C. Section 547 and 548, where transfers may have been accomplished that could have been preferential to certain creditors. And 548, fraudulent transfers. For goodness sakes, I see enough of those where the debtor has moved money or assets or stock or options, whatever it might be, over to another party that is not in the case. And so they answer their schedules that they file and say they don't have that. They don't describe it because they transferred it off somewhere. These fraudulent transfers have become somewhat of a specialty. I laugh because I've never seen a case where we weren't able to catch a fraudulent transfer. People don't understand that we know how to find these things, for God's sakes. It's a very interesting and dynamic situation. So with the hotel case, I was able to move all the problems out of the way, deal directly with this main secured creditor and say to the secured creditor, please give me X days before you do anything, file a motion to dismiss or anything. I'll get this thing on track. I'll get you paid off. And they trusted me, and I did. I was able to bring an investor in literally the night before the hearing to dismiss this case or convert it to Chapter 7. At 11 p.m., I had all of the paperwork finished. I had started at 6 a.m. that morning. I'll never forget it. And every single piece of paper needed, every motion, every order, every amendment to whatever's been filed was finished.
Yes.
Without eating in between, by the way. And I got all that done so that the next morning I was able to say to Judge Funk, who is awesome, or was awesome on the bench,
Yes.
brilliant, and he knew that there was a way I could get this done. He couldn't say, of course, but I did. And at that first hearing, that next morning, I'll never forget Judge Funk's comments. Mr. Newburgh, you pulled a rabbit out of the hat.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah, and I've seen Judge Funk on other social functions. For example, at the 11th Circuit Judicial Conference I was invited to. And the first thing Judge Funk said to me was, oh my God, that case with the syringe. And there's a long story to this hotel case, but one of the parties planted syringes in the beds of our American servicemen and women that were serving in a nearby fort, a nearby base.
Yeah.
And they wanted to force us to cancel the contract, the government contract, so that they would not be held to it. So they wanted to make the debtor, which is a hotel, look like they're involved in people that do drugs in their room and things like that.
Oh, no.
Well, I caught them.
Yeah.
And I caught them red-handed. And because of that, I received an additional $400,000 just in sanctions that Judge Funk handed out for those behaviors.
Yeah.
Not only did I have a few extra dollars, but I was able to pay off every single creditor in that case 100% of their claim.
Amazing.
It's a story.
Yeah. So that leads me to the next question. What have some of your biggest lessons and learnings been within your career? And I'm sure you've had multiple, but if you had to pick one, what would stand out for you the most?
The Great Eastern Energy case, I think, was an amazing thing. We were able to I put a team together. Look, Chapter 11, it does not work unless you have a team that works as if you're a family member. I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
So you have to be so comfortable with the people sitting next to you that you can criticize what they're suggesting, not have it take personally, and to receive feedback on what you're trying to do or think. So it is really a think tank you must form before you take a case, or you are just dead in the water, in my view. What I did for Great Eastern was I put together not just a team, but probably the best consultant by far in the United States in the energy sector, still is working for me. And the Clear firm in Philadelphia and Delaware, I brought them in because they handled the Jevick case and Toys R Us. And I felt that that was the kind of Delaware bankruptcy thinking that I needed for Great Eastern, meaning I needed highly analytical and lawyers that could handle a subject matter they did not know. And relying upon my late leadership and advice with regard to the energy sector. So what did I do? I studied for a year, hours and hours, working with the former chair of the New York Energy Commission and my other consultants that I had hired. They taught me this business. And then I was running that business hands-on. The president and the other officers no longer involved. So I made sure with what we call keeps and kerps, agreements to keep people, to incentivize them not to leave. And that's hard. The company is going to liquidation. How do you keep people working for you? You give them a contract that makes them very happy and is fair. And I did. I kept a crew so that I was able to make the hedges, which is how this business works. I was able to keep the New York and New Jersey Port Authority without going into default. I was able to keep all of our ISOs active. And so I had a flow of energy during the case so that it was what we call an ongoing business concern without question. I had flow, I had AR, I had money coming in money going out, but money coming in.
Yeah.
And the hedges, that's how this business works, right? If you make a hedge in September and you put that hedge into the market, you buy it, well, that hedge is for the purpose of you're betting that in the summertime that it's going to be hot and people are going to be using electricity for AC. And that other hedge you put in is going to be the bet that in the wintertime, you're not going to have a month of 68-degree temperatures where people aren't going to use the natural gas that you just bet on.
Yes.
That's how this business works since deregulation. And the other facet of Great Eastern Energy was I did something that was perhaps a bit controversial and new. And that was, I went to the court and I said, Judge, there are renewable energy credits that this company is holding. And renewable energy credits is where this entire country is going. Just yesterday, FERC announced a plan to redo certain regulations. So to encourage more flow of electricity that is produced by wind and water and solar power. And this is where we must go in order to get our country into a green or greener situation. So
yes.
It's very confusing, but a REC credit is a renewable energy credit, meaning if my company that I have in Chapter 11 is going to supply 10,000 megawatt hours of energy at a certain rate, well, if you got that from coal, in other words, energy coming from coal, you've got to have a corresponding energy credit that is a renewable. You're sort of making sure that if you're going to use coal or another energy source that may not be as good for the environment as a renewable source, well, then you have to buy renewable energy credits because each state requires that you either provide that green energy, and if you can't, you have to buy a renewable energy certificate and you have to post it or get it into that state's Department of Revenue, however the regulators have it in their particular state. You have to do it by a certain date. It requires a lot of money if you haven't gotten them and accumulated them over the year. There are very strange markets involved that have 90-day windows. None of them correspond to each other. So you have to understand the market windows in order to sell them. So I went to Judge Carey. I said, Judge, why is this any different than the farmer who's in a Chapter 12 and has a silo out back, and he or she fills the silo with wheat during the year that he's got to sell or she has to sell by a certain date? Well, if we're in bankruptcy, Judge, and nobody will buy it from us, well, why can't we consider that the same thing as accumulating renewable energy credits? I've stored them here. They're in a computer system, but that's a silo. And Judge, if I don't do anything with them, I'm not monetizing an asset for the benefit of the creditors. So it makes sense to not sell them. And the judge allowed me to do this. It was, I think, highly controversial, but no one objected. And that was interesting because I made sure every single regulatory agency was served with notice beyond what Rule 2002 of bankruptcy rules would require. I went my way to make sure I could show the court when they finally approved the sale, which was very successful. I brought in over $9 million just from those sale of renewable energy credits. This is a creditor. I want to top this off. I'm working with a creditor that has a blanket lien on everything, that is one of the largest financiers of energy in the world. Very demanding and very smart. And so what I did was I made sure that in the beginning of the case, they said, we don't expect to get anything back here. You have to convince us to pay for the case, which means if administrative expenses accrue, that creditor is going to cover so that I can keep that company running until I wind it down. That's exactly what happened here. And I don't want to quote the exact number, but suffice to say that I brought back to that creditor about $35 million in collaterals, and letters of credit have been amended systematically as I work through the wind down. Well, I did it by negotiating these deals with everybody. So that's why at the beginning, a lot of Chapter 11, you never want to have to litigate a motion. It's wasteful. It is contrary to the principle that I stand by, and that is a good Chapter 11 is a Chapter 11 where you have everyone at the table, everything's been worked out, everybody is slightly unhappy, but it's the best result. And that comes in. So there's an example of what you have to do creatively, which I never had the opportunity to do in a Chapter 11 before representing a debtor. So it was perhaps the most significant event in my entire career.
Wow.
Because I was able to get this company wound down without hard dropping thousands of customers, without doing anything but making sure that certain people were getting paid up until the end of the case, and systematically winding down, meaning each utility, each ISO, we would gradually collect that AR flow, and then we would cut off our flow that we were allowed to have and time it such that the last amount of the account receivable that would be payable to us is paid to us at an exact time that would correspond with the beginning of a wind down of the next ISO.
Yes.
You can't do them all at one time. You'd need a crew of 1,000 people negotiating. So I went to each utility, each ISO, and with my team, we were able to knock this one out of the park. And we never had to file a plan. We never had to file, we had no opposition to any of our motions except for one party that had separate reasons for objecting, let's say.
Yeah.
And so we worked through everything. Even that motion ended up in an agreement. And that is the golden rule for me. And instructions to my entire team that I assembled. And I have to mention Tom Buck of Glass Ratner and B. Riley. If I didn't have someone like that, there is no one like Tom Buck, but if I didn't have Tom Buck, no way I could have done this case. He was able to look at spreadsheets with me. We were able to do forensic analysis of various segments. We were able to find $30 million of unbooked liabilities, for God's sakes.
Wow.
So working the forensic side at the same time as you're understanding the business, how do you run that business?
Yes.
What I was able to accomplish, I've never been able to do that before in a Chapter 11 case. And now I receive phone calls probably on a weekly basis from various ESCOs and even from some ISO individuals and officers who are frankly starting to get into a little trouble. Each time an ESCO goes bankrupt, that ISO loses thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I'm giving you a lot of information here, and it's hard to describe everything, but I'm trying to give folks a reasonable.
No, it's good. I mean, I think people need a good insight for sure. So I just want to extend from what you're saying. Obviously, the area of bankruptcy law is very intense, and it must be exceedingly difficult when you're working with clients who are on the verge of losing everything, and obviously emotions running high, and obviously the level of pressure and stress. So how do you manage and maintain expectations of your clients, and how do you assist your clients to navigate through this process?
What a great question, because now we're getting into the job as frankly, a psychiatrist. I wouldn't even say a psychologist.
Yes.
We're getting to the level of psychiatry where I am telling people that are losing everything. For example, those are usually the equity holders, right?
Yes.
Most of the time, those equity holders are the people running the company also. The president, the vice president, it could be the director, be the managing member. And it is tragic. Sometimes we look at companies that have been built up by two people over 20 years, and they're making $500 million a year, just like the Great Eastern Energy case. And I'm not saying that the facts I'm going to give you relate to that, but certainly I had a $500 million a year company and needed to wind down. So what do? The first thing is I point out in the retention agreement to the people signing on behalf of the company, I might have to sue you. And you always get a look back like, well, why should I hire you if you're going to turn around and sue me? And that's where I have to sit down and explain the nuts and bolts of Chapter 11, and that we can't change the code. We can modify it through motions and requests and agreements. But the code says that if the estate has a claim against an officer or director or managing member that accrued pre-petition, well, you have to go after that. Sometimes it's discretionary, but sometimes it's not. For example, if you have a creditors committee, you may have to. But I was able to convince the trustee to not appoint a creditors committee in this case so that I can get it done without litigation. And the clients begin to understand your job when they see progress, because in many instances, there are what we call bad boy guarantees that the directors have executed. They're very afraid of personal liability. And not only that, but oh my God, the lawyer we're going to hire here says in his agreement, gee, I might have to get my own lawyer. You know, what's going on here? I make sure they get a lawyer that they're comfortable with. I develop a relationship and conversational friendship with them so that they can make their clients feel better. It's not my job to do that, but it is my job to facilitate the clients to be comfortable. Very, very difficult. I got a lot of that skill from, I chair the pro bono committee for the Southern District of Florida, for example, and have come up with many of the pro bono programs we have here. So it's a whole different level, right? I'm dealing with $500 million a year companies, and on the same time, I'm getting people who have no money, a lawyer, a volunteer lawyer to help them so that they can put food on the table. They have kids, they don't have a car. And I'm telling you this because the developing skills of negotiating with your own client in Chapter 11, who are very sophisticated businessmen, it requires the same kind of psychology, believe it or not. When I talk to a prospective Chapter 7 filer who's poor, they're afraid. They don't know what this is. They don't know what the end result is. You have to talk to your client. And a lot of don't do that. A lot of firms have various levels where you really don't get to the partner in charge of the case. You're dealing with paralegals, associates, and whatnot. Well, you might deal with that in my firm, but not without me on the phone or me. So I'm hands-on. I don't pass off, and I found that that makes people much more comfortable. Not that there's anything wrong with the other folks handling what they need to handle, but when they know the boss is on the line and overseeing things, they have more comfort. And so what Great Eastern was just an opening for me to take to get into a sub-industry, which is retail and wholesale energy supply, knowing that this entire country is changing right now after deregulation, knowing that renewable energy credits are going to be a critical issue in the next 10 to 15 years. Well, that's why I got into this. I want to develop that boutique where the business owners know that if they come to me for Chapter 11, they're going to do well. They're going to get through this. Team, and I've got the political relationships with all the ISOs and regulators that you're not going to find everywhere. There's some firms that have it, but it's very few. This is sort of a new industry after deregulation. So they're not a lot of lawyers that are going to go study it for a year, are they?
No.
That's why Great Eastern, for me, is the most significant moment in my career, was to successfully land millions of dollars back into the hands of a creditor that loaned an extraordinary number of millions of dollars when they expected nothing back they got millions back.
Amazing.
Are they happy? Well, not really, because they lost a lot of money. But I really softened that blow.
Amazing.
That felt great.
So that obviously leads me now into wanting to talk about leadership, or the lack of leadership on both a corporate and global level. What would you say makes your leadership style different? And when leading a team of lawyers, can you give us some examples? And what do you believe to be fundamentally important as a leader? And what do you believe can be done better on a corporate and global level to change the current narrative?
That's another great question. I consider being a leader is not anything unless the followers are following.
Yes.
And the only way to be a leader is to make sure everyone following understands what they're supposed to do and that they get some kind of enjoyment out of it. You cannot have a team led by anyone if there's dissonance, unhappiness, misunderstandings, lack of communication. All of those ingredients must be part of how I deal with my team. The success that we get is by getting everyone together all the time in meetings, and to make sure everyone is in I use something, Microsoft Workstreams AI and various Microsoft programs to keep everyone in touch with one another in real time as they work through the Chapter 11. And I divide up into about 6, 7 different divisions so that I have a team handling the regulatory issues. I have a team handling customer calls. Customers, by the way, in this business mean generally corporations that own many, many buildings with thousands of residents. Don't think of end user. We're dealing not with end users, we're dealing with big companies. So having all of that structure is, as a leader, imperative, because I can't deal with every segment at the same time of the business. So everyone has to have a separate section, a very, very clear and concise roadmap to where we are now, and then showing them where we need to be for their division. Let's say it's regulatory compliance, making sure they know they have to contact Department of Revenue or the Department of Energy, whoever the board might be in that state, and they must meet their criteria to get to the end point of their section's job. So if I have 7 of those teams working at the same time, it's not too burdensome for me. I'm able to monitor everyone's work in every section. You know, that's how you be a leader. And I do something perhaps most other lawyers don't. I inject a whole lot of humor into what I do.
Well, you have to, especially in the realm of what you do. Otherwise, it could be very dull and probably stressful.
Well, it is that. And I don't know if you know, but you know, when people smile, you release dopamine. And it's just, to me, it's an important part of being a lawyer, is to not take things so seriously that you are just this stern, stoic individual that people feel they can't approach. You inject a little bit of comedy and humor into things that happen, then the people that were involved in something that might have gone wrong, they feel much better. They don't feel like their leader is going to be angry and against them. You know, I might be disappointed inside. I try not to show that. I try to encourage people. So, you know, that hooks into the last part of your question. Corporate America does not do this, period.
No. To elaborate on that, I would assume that some cases were so complex that they required the allocation of large numbers of staff. So how do you manage that process and that situation? Because that also comes into, obviously, leadership in your position as well.
It's probably a misconception that the more complex your matter, the more people you need. It's more a function of, as the complexity increases, I actually may want to have fewer people, because I have to teach those people. I'm responsible. If it gets very complex, and trust me, they happen all the time, where I have to go back to the books and make sure that I know exactly what I'm talking about and exactly what the law says, not just in the circuit, the federal circuit I'm in, but every circuit. Because if I have another decision in another circuit that is similar to my fact pattern, and the decision is not the same as the circuit I'm in, be it the Second Circuit, Third Circuit, or 11th Circuit, where my cases are, well, I figure out a way, if I can, to get our circuit, our court, to go with a change. And that's part of the beauty of what we do as lawyers, period, is our ability to convince courts that there might be a better way. And just because a higher court might have ruled a certain way, I can differentiate the facts in another case such that the court is comfortable in applying a different rule and more like another jurisdiction's manner of treating it. And remember, this is not a contest between circuits and judges. This is a learning experience for every judge in every circuit to see an opinion on similar facts and to understand what the differentiated facts are, and to see whether or not I can fit what would normally be a round peg in a square hole. You have to make the hole round. That's
absolutely.
Right. But the section of the Bankruptcy Code is 11 U.S.C. Section 105. We call that, it's the saving grace of the Bankruptcy Code. What does it do? Pretty much allows the judge to do whatever he or she wants at their discretion, because we have cases where the code may say one thing or require one thing, and the bankruptcy rules of procedure may require one thing, and the local rules of bankruptcy procedure are the same. But the court is convinced from a presentation I might give that that result would be inequitable. And that's usually where unsecured creditors are not going to get a penny. We want them to be paid something. So that's where that section 105 is beautiful. Allows me to ask the court to modify this a little bit, Judge, because it's not fair otherwise. I love that argument, and it works. I'm sorry.
No, that's right. So the pandemic has obviously changed our world forever, turning it upside down and inside out. So how did this impact you and your firm? And you must have obviously seen a sharp rise in bankruptcy. So can you share with us more about this time and how the changes affected your practice?
The very first set of cases that started to flow in had to do with building owners in Manhattan, usually owning 2 or 3 buildings at a time. And those buildings are normally commercial rental buildings where various companies will lease 1 or 2 floors. So we're talking millions of dollars essentially for each client at stake. The tenants, they can't pay their rent, they have to move. All kinds of things have been happening. But the first strike here from pandemic was the fact that people weren't going into the office, for God's sakes, in Manhattan, and they weren't paying their rent. So, you know, who's holding the bag here is the building owner. So
of course.
All of these bankruptcies now that have been filed in the city are really products of what's happening in real time real estate, as I call it, meaning right down to who's occupying premises and who's not, and what building owners are going to lose their shirt if it's not restructured or changed or sold. So that was the first flow from the pandemic. And that's going to continue because we have to have some kind of hybrid model unless and until everyone goes back to an office structure. I personally am in favor of hybrid, where I think
it's much better.
Yes, I think people should be able to work from home if they're just as productive at home as they are in the office. And there have to be a lot of firms and companies thinking the same way. Why pay $500,000 a month for 3 floors of this building when 2 of those floors can be working remotely and we can sell those 2 floors? So we're going to see changes. We're going to see hybrids. We're going to see different formats for leasing space. We're going to see renovation of existing spaces to where walls are broken down and small offices are broken into open areas
Yeah.
where shared
I
resources.
have a question to that. Do you think that, and obviously I'm just thinking in terms of cities like New York, if, for example, a lot of those become hybrid or otherwise, and some of those buildings end up, maybe becoming obsolete in an office format, do you think that some of these buildings will be converted into residential?
I personally think they will be. They have to be.
Yeah.
Owning a building and you're not filling every space, you're in trouble, period.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
losing money. So why not take 2 of the floors that previously were office oriented, put a doorman downstairs, make it residential, add some amenities, and create apartments that might be very attractive, add something to the mix that others don't have. Creativity is the key to business, period. And if you think outside the box, which requires you to sit down with a few people that you love and trust along with your client, you can work through these issues and find solutions that become profit instead of loss. Very important to have. What's the most important thing? To listen to what people say.
Yes. So in saying that, what would you say, what has been one of your biggest career highlights? And I'm sure you probably had many, but what really stands out for you as a highlight in your career?
I have to go back to 2 things. One was my transition 13, 14 years ago into 100% bankruptcy, where I won't even appear in a state court case because I'm often called upon as an expert witness in a bankruptcy case. And I also counsel judges. Judge Mora and I go around to circuit court judges, courthouses, and we teach fundamentals of bankruptcy. One of the most important achievements in my career, and one that brings me great joy, is being able to teach trial court judges in state court what they need to know when they have a notice of a bankruptcy from a party in the middle of a trial or right before a trial starts. Well, unfortunately, many of the judges are not quite sure how to rule. They're not really sure about this thing we call concurrent jurisdiction, where certainly circuit court judge has the right to determine whether or not a stay is applicable to every party in the case, and they have to freeze the case, or can they allow it to go forward? Well, it requires an analysis. Is that party that filed bankruptcy indispensable to the outcome? If not, and you proceed, do you risk inconsistent verdicts from 2 different cases? So these are very important things with regard, very important factors in bankruptcy. So in getting to, well, gee, what's the biggest milestone? I would say really that ability to get Great Eastern Energy done was to me very much a miracle. And to each case that I've had in the past 6, 7 years, I've been pull the rabbit out of the hat. I don't know if it's luck, skill, or what, or the universe behind me.
I think you just have a natural ability, honestly, because that's not something everybody can do.
I'll accept that. I do my best to make my client happy and to make the U.S. trustee happy, to make every party cooperative. And that's my greatest success, because it goes through the formation of all the pro bono initiatives that I've incorporated down here. It travels through every single facet of my practice. Just the ability to sit down and talk through issues, gaining the trust and confidence of a prospective client, educating them, listening to them. I did not do that when I was a commercial litigator. I was a nasty SOB, frankly, as a commercial litigator. So there was no negotiating with me. I was ruthless, and that was my job. So that transition into more of a gentleman's practice, I should say gentle person's practice, was extraordinary for me. It changed the way I live, the way I look at life, because
Yeah.
I really, from being
Well,
a very,
you also have, even though it's very direct and it's very, like, you have to be obviously very honest and communicate, but you also have a level of empathy. So I think that does reflect probably in your work as well.
and I'm glad you said that, because lawyers need to understand if you're not feeling something for someone, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, exactly. So when you've worked on some really massive cases right down to the wire, can you share with us more about some of these cases and some of the best outcomes you've had for your clients and how you've managed to achieve this in such a finite time?
It's the end result.
Yes.
It's how you get there. And getting to that place where you've finished a case, you've done everything that you could do. It joins everyone involved in that case together, including the opposing parties, the secured creditors.
Yes.
A lot of times, remember, I'm on the other side. I'm representing the creditor, representing the creditor committee. So the Chapter 11 world is one where we just as easily represent clients as creditors as we do debtors in possession. It's the
Yes.
same exact process. I'm sitting down representing the secured creditor with the lawyers representing the debtor. I'm on the other side of the table. It is exactly the same job, believe it or not, because I'm overseeing what they are doing as if I were doing it and telling them or objecting to what they're doing if it's inconsistent. Not that I am the last word, certainly not. Many bankruptcy lawyers are more smarter and better at this than me and longer at it. But it's this technique that I have that every lawyer, I think, in bankruptcy has, by the way. We are really a mental person's bar. We don't yell, we don't argue, we don't use ad hominem attacks, we don't attack the other counsel, we don't attack people on the stand.
Yeah.
We deal with facts, we deal with them properly and politely, and we try to work things out. It's a whole different way of lawyering. So those great milestones, those successes that I've had in my cases are a product of that, in my view. In addition to knowledge, each case that I get, whether it's creditor side or debtor side, I study the death out of that company. I want to know how it works, right on down to who has to replace the toilet tissue. I want to know how much money is going to that person. I want to know, do I need to keep them on board? How many employees can I keep working is a very big responsibility. I don't want anyone to lose their job in a Chapter 11, especially if it's an ongoing business concern. But at the same time, I'd lose my job as debtor possession counsel if I kept everybody employed pre-petition, employed during the bankruptcy. My job is to. Now, the other side, reorganize, restructure. A lot easier, believe it or not, than winding down. And the reason for that is most of the time we're negotiating what those plans of the term, what the terms of that plan are going to be before I file it. That's my style, to make sure that when I file it, I'm not hit with all kinds of dismissal motions and oppositions. Get everybody's agreement first. And then what I do, I get into that case and I make sure that all of our first day motions are filed on the first day. That seems to have been lost by some lawyers I know. But to get all of those required motions in on day one and to have them set for emergency hearing as we do, to make sure the lights can stay on legally under the code, to make sure that the vendors can continue to come and supply, to make sure that I've obtained orders that restrain any movement of customers, for example, when dealing with channel partners in an energy wind down or reorganization. So it's a loaded question you asked me. It's every case is a milestone for me. Every single case And even a small case where I'm representing two people through their law firm in a personal injury case, in, for example, the Hertz case that I'm in, where unfortunately I must get on average about 30 to 40 emails a day from the court. Such a big case. But even that small representation of a creditor in a big, big case, I found my way through there. I found the right people to contact to get things resolved outside of the reading all 13 motions I get every day in that case.
Yes.
So again, that's my milestone, my ability to work through issues, whether it be on creditor side, debtor side, and to do it all the same way. A lot of times for the creditor, I need to form those same 7 teams I just told you about.
Yes. So when working on each case, how much time do you spend inside a courtroom, and how much time do you have to prepare? And what is the longest case you've ever had to deal with or work on?
Well, since I'm still involved, part of my practice is representing Chapter 7 trustees. Those cases can run, my oldest one I'm still in right now, it's a clawback case involving an international fraud of CMOs and CLOs, which are collateralized mortgage obligations or collateralized loan obligations. They're packaged investments. They're like ice cubes. They melt. There was worth nothing at a certain point because they're interest-only payments. I do these clawback cases for trustees and claims representation. Oftentimes I'm brought in as special counsel to trustee to take care, because I came in for a client, so I can only represent the trustee as special counsel. But from that work I did for that creditor, the trustee says, you know, Mr. Newburgh, will you please represent the trustee for the rest of the case concerning other claims? And that is how I'm able to work through everything that comes across my desk, is to plan things out with a Chapter 7 trustee on what they want and balance that against the expectations of unsecured creditors. Every case is so different. You have no idea, Karen. So you could have the same circumstances in a Chapter 11, the same business, but then you look at the spreadsheets and you're looking at a completely different case.
Yes.
Hard to describe, but it's the most exciting area of law I could ever imagine. There's so much, it's so detailed, it's so deep. So how much time do I spend in the beginning of Chapter 11s? If I'm representing a debtor, we stay up for a couple days in a row just to get the first day motions all together. It's kind of traditional where we pull all-nighters in the beginning. We want to get this stuff in and done and perfect. It's out of the way. We're ready for our emergency hearings. We don't have to think about filings anymore. So everything has to be systematic, controlled, guided, negotiated. It's an awful lot. And then, you know, personally, I have to oftentimes put in at least 16 hours a day in order to get 8 billable hours out of that. Remember that.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I do legal research on an issue coming up in a case, there are a lot of times I can't bill a client for that because it's presumed that I would know that. And if I don't, how is that fair for me to charge a client for that?
Yeah, no, very true. So that
ahead.
actually leads me into the question of, obviously you're in a very demanding job. So how do you manage and maintain family life and personal time while holding such a massive responsibility, not only to your practice, but also to your clients? So can you give us any examples?
Absolutely. People who know me consider me as some kind of Leonardo da Vinci character. I'm an avid sailor. I can take a sailboat apart and restore it myself. I've been doing it for years. I'm a semi-professional photographer. I used to have a situation where people would purchase my artwork, my photographs. I still do. I still take at least, I would say, 1,000 photographs a week, And my focus is botanicals and very unusual subject matter that thankfully people love out there, and brings
Yeah,
me a
because
lot
they
of
want something different. I think
right.
that's also the thing.
And I can't tell you how good that feels as an artist for people to say, "Ah, that's fantastic," and it boosts you. And my biggest thing is I'm a musician, so when I come home at the end of the day, if I do, um, what I do is I just plug in and I play, usually for 2 or 3 hours.
Mm.
I could come home and be in the mood to play a 12 string, and come home, be in the mood to play blues or Grateful Dead songs or something I'm writing. I write a lot of my own music. That completely takes me out of my job. I know that's hard to believe, but as a musician, I think if any musician's listening, they're going to know what I'm talking about. You start with your guitar, your piano, your sax, I don't care what it is, and you're to that for an hour, you're gone. There
Yeah.
is no, you're not bound by your day or your persona. You are connected with what you're hearing, what you're playing. It is the most incredible sensation. And I finish that, I feel like I took a vacation.
Amazing. So your career has spanned years as a bankruptcy lawyer with stints as a complex litigator. Can you share with us more about this, and having the diversity within your career, has this given you an advantage?
Absolutely. As I said, or alluded to before, I don't think I would have been as good, or I wouldn't have been as proficient in what I'm doing now if I were not a commercial litigator before. For me to experience the way people fight in state court, the way a motion is filed every single time something happens, somebody files an opposition, and what a waste of time and energy. It's astounding to me that the system is the way it is. And then parties waiting for 2 years to go to trial. My God, in bankruptcy, we have an issue, we tee it up, we go to trial within a month. So it's astounding to me that I actually practiced in that area. And what did it do? It taught me that I can't force things to a conclusion. I have to play with the process. And how did I end up doing that? By figuring out, well, if I filed this motion, it's going to take 6 months before it's decided. And if it's a certain way, I'm going to be looking at an appeal. How do I explain to my client they have to send me another $50,000 retainer? So what I do, that's when I started negotiating my way through cases. I'd pick up the phone and talk with opposing counsel and try to reach their persona, their heart. I know it sounds funny, but I call folks a lot and I say, counselor, let's talk about what's best for our respective clients. Is it for us to fight over this motion? Neither of us know which way it's going to turn out, but the client's going to spend $100,000. Or is it better for us to reach some kind of agreement right now on this issue? 90% of the time, I was able to resolve the issues. And as I drew out of the really contentious area that I was involved in commercial litigation, that's how I gravitated naturally into bankruptcy. I wanted to practice in a court that was composed of gentle people. And we're not gentle, but composed of people that keep their temper, that have great deal of respect for the system and for the judge and for the court and for the authority of the United States bankruptcy system. And a love for the code and a willingness to read the cases every morning that come out. And I mean, that's it. That's how the transition was so beautiful. And it's something that every lawyer has to decide upon at a certain point if they're bored with what they're doing, or trouble, or they have too much stress every day. Well, look at what you're doing, for God's sakes.
Exactly. So that leads me to the next question. What are the 3 key pieces of advice you would give to others looking to pursue a similar career?
Number 1, become a physician. Number two would be really studying your material, knowing the case, and becoming a doctor is a joke, but you find that most lawyers that I know sort of have that choice at some point where they're either going to be a doctor or a lawyer. I don't know why that is.
Yeah.
I grew up in a house full of doctors. It was presumed I would be, working with my dad in the hospital, right?
Mm.
So it's a matter of just deciding, number one, that you really want to do this, that there's nothing else in the world you'd rather do, because it sure does take a toll on you.
Yes.
And number two, to make sure that if you're unhappy in what you're doing, to change it, because if you're not going to make it, you're not going to be happy in life. And I don't know why I would do anything in my job if it wasn't making me happy outside of my job. That's stress, and no one should have to experience that.
No.
There's so many areas, so many different industries you can go into as private counsel, so many different areas of federal law that are, in my view, heads above practicing in the state court system. So number two is really being careful and flexible. If you're not happy, figure out what you might be happy with. For God's sakes, don't punish yourself. You're not going to do, I guarantee you won't do a good job. No. Number three, you've got to develop a support network. What you say is true, and it probably doesn't show on my face, the amount of stress and pressure I'm under right now. You have to have support people and your own support network in your head.
Yes.
And if that means you have to go for cognitive therapy, I don't care, go do it.
Yeah.
But you have to be straight in what you're doing and not distracted by thoughts that have anything to do with whether you're liking this or not, bored, or it's too much work. Those things will kill you. You got to learn to deal with your own personal needs. And when you have overstress and when you have burnout, it's something you can change by getting help. So number three, for God's sakes, have support people in your life. Talk about how you feel. Call a lawyer you trust. Every bar in this country has a support network. Well, why? Well, because we have a lot of lawyers that need it, right?
Yes.
So I always say, use it, for God's sakes. You're overstressed, you're burning out, get some help first, and then go back to number two, be flexible.
Yes. So that leads me to the final question. What legacy would you like to leave, or how would you like to be remembered?
It's such a difficult question, but I think the thing I'm most proud of are the pro bono programs that I've been able to implement, and getting all the pro se debtors who can't afford a lawyer to designing programs and implementing them, making them work. We have help desks now for each judge, for each court, where people show up who are creditors or debtors, and they have no idea what to do. They might have filed it themselves, which is a terrible idea, and now they're in trouble. But I think I'm going to be remembered more for the things that I've done in pro bono, just for the benefit of people.
Yeah.
That's going to be it. I think it's secondary, frankly, that I might have been a great Chapter 11 lawyer or a good chapter.
Yeah.
It's somewhat secondary when you really think about matters in life. I get more joy out of seeing that I helped somebody that they otherwise would have been out on the street.
Yes.
It's hard to explain, but you have to do a pro bono case and get through it to understand what I mean.
Yes.
There is nothing better than getting a card, and I get a lot of them, from people that just are so thankful. I can almost see their tears on the card, that their kids are being fed, they've got a new job, they bought a new car, things are turning around, they get a fresh start. Is there anything really that we do as lawyers that could be more satisfying than that?
Yeah. Not much.
My legacy is going to be very much part of how far I go in these Chapter 11s, the energy cases. I want to be the maven in this country. And, along with the pro bono, you got to give back. You have to help these people. It's not all about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Stephen. I really appreciate it. And if people would like to connect with you, what are the best platforms to do so?
I have so many platforms, for God's sake. I think the best place is probably LinkedIn, where you find my profile, you find contact information. Also, you go right on my firm's website, McLaughlin and Stern in New York. There are many ways, and I have no problem giving out my New York cell numbers. Things like that are on my contact sheet.
Okay.
I don't have a problem with people texting me, calling me out of the blue, because it happens every day.
Yes.
So it's not a problem for me. I actually kind of enjoy juggling, and I really enjoy answering questions. I have a hotline where the circuit court judges can call me directly. I can't tell you how many calls I've gotten in the middle of a trial, and the judge says, "Mr. Newburgh, I just want you to know, counsel for the plaintiff and defendant are sitting in front of me. We're in the middle of the trial. One of the parties has just filed a suggestion of bankruptcy, and both parties here are arguing back and forth on the code provision. And, sir, this is the hotline. Can you help?"
Well, that's amazing.
It's so much fun to actually, show these three people sitting in the courtroom, the judge and the two parties, that the answer is pretty simple, but you have to figure it out. Is that party indispensable to your case? Are you going to screw this up so that there might be an inconsistent verdict if you say the case? And are you going to prejudice the parties that are not filing bankruptcy if you don't proceed to the trial? Tough question. So we are trying very hard to get judges comfortable with what to do in these situations where they don't need to call the hotline. So in postscript here, I'm working on the Florida Supreme Court commissioned me to prepare a handbook for the circuit court judges in the state of Florida that would be like a handbook online, and where when something happens that I know will happen in their circuit court system, they can turn to a tab and get an idea of what the answer is. And these things are so important to me. So, pro bono, judicial education, being, a great bankruptcy lawyer, of course, everybody wants to do that. But you have to do the other things also. So I guess my postscript.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen, again for your time. And hopefully we can have you back in the future to see where you are in your legal journey.
I'd love to be back, Karen. Thank you so much.